We're just going to jump into this. Now, the tan areas on this map, this is why the United States is the global superpower. The greater Midwest system is the largest and most productive agricultural zone on the planet. Outproduces the next two zones put together. And as important as that is, that's really a side note. It's the blue lines that crisscross that system, the greater Mississippi system. This is 13,000 miles of navigable waterway. Well, why is that important? Well, those of you who are in the oil business know moving things from A to B is a bit of a bitch. But if you float it, it's 1/13 the cost. And that assumes that the road, the rail, the pipe infrastructure is already in place. If you don't have that, it's typically a 50-to-1 advantage. In the highlands, it's a 100-to-1 advantage. The United States, in just that one system, has more miles of navigable waterway than the rest of the planet put together. In addition, there are forests and lakes to the north. There are deserts and mountains to the south. There are oceans on either side. The United States is the most secure piece of physical geography on the planet. So it's rich, it's safe, it's secure. We can't mess this up. We've tried. So even in the worst case scenario, where somehow there's a third Obama term, and halfway through, there's a crochet disaster, and Donald Trump ends up taking over. And then we spend the next 32 years bouncing back and forth between the Clinton and the Bush dynasties. You're going to be fine. Okay, so let's talk about how we Americans, Let's talk about how we Americans see the world. And what we think of here as ancient history, the world was imperial. You had the French Navy protecting French trade between the French mainland and the French colonies. The Brits did the same, the Japanese the same, and so on. It was a sequestered imperial economic network. You didn't trade with the country next to you because you never knew when some idiot whose language you didn't understand was going to throw a war, and you'd lose access to whatever raw material or market or trade route you thought was so important. So you kept it in-house. You competed with all of these other imperial systems. Those competitions led to wars. Those wars culminated in World War II. And at the end of that war, the only country that had a navy and an economy left was the United States, and the US changed the rules of the game. Now, instead of everybody having their own separate system, we were going to merge all participants into one global whole. The US would patrol the sea lanes for absolutely everybody, and everyone could also export goods to the United States more or less duty-free and export their way back to affluence. There were a couple of catches. The biggest one is you had to allow the Americans to fight the Cold War their way. You heard that right. We bribed up an alliance to contain and ultimately crush the Soviets. And it worked really well. Global GDP expanded by a factor of 10. The global population tripled. And we saw the Soviets fall further and further behind with every passing year. We'd expand the network, first to Western Europe, then to the defeated Axis, ultimately even to the Chinese Communist Party. How did we enforce it? It's not all that complicated. The carrier on the right, that's a traditional jump carrier. There's 10 of those on the planet. The one on the left is a supercarrier. There's 10 of those on the planet. Not one of the jump carriers is American. Every single one of the supercarriers is American. And we're in the process of retiring all of them to replace them with bigger carriers. The United States has enjoyed a 10-to-1 ratio in naval force projection advantage versus the combined navies of the rest of the planet since 1944. And the reason that free trade works, the reason that the Bretton Woods system has lasted so long, is the United States has chosen to put that differential at the service of the global commons. Without American engagement, without the American Navy doing what it does well, there would not be a global free trade regime. But what most people miss is that for the United States, global trade has never been about trade. It's not even about economics. It's about security. As a percentage of GDP, the United States is the least involved economy in the world. Only 7% of our total economic strength comes from exports now, and half of that's NAFTA. So you can have the United States step back from the global system, step back from supporting a global structure that was designed for a war that ended 25 years ago, and we'll have a recession that's roughly on par with what we went through in 1990 for a year, and then we're back to normal. But for the rest of the world, for countries like China that get 40% of GDP from trade, or Germany where it's 50, that's the end. So never forget that the global system is one American bad hair day away from a breakdown. That's piece one. Let's talk piece two. This is demography. Now what you have here is a demographic pyramid. Children on the bottom, retirees on the top. It's a pyramid simply because of mortality. Now you can split any demographic grouping into three big pieces. The first one are your young adults, people who are roughly aged 20 to 45. These are the folks that are just starting out, and it's all about consumption. They're buying houses, they're buying cars, they're raising kids, they're smoking pot. It's spend, 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 spend. But they're at the early end of their earning potential. So all of this consumption requires borrowing, car loans, house loans. Next, you've got your mature workers, people roughly aged 40 to 65. These folks are sending the kids off, the house is paid off, they're saving for retirement. Just as the younger group generates most of the economic growth from their consumption, this age bracket generates most of the investment in the system and most of the tax dollars. So 70% of consumption from the younger cohort, 70% of tax dollars and investment from the older cohort. And then you've got your mature workers who step back from the system, shift their savings from stocks and bonds into T-bills and cash because they can't take the volatility, and basically become dormant from an economic point of view. This is how it normally is. This is a strict capital model. You got a small generation providing capital to a large generation. So certain patterns emerge. If you want to borrow, you have to, for a business, you have to have a business plan. If you want to get a car loan, your car is the collateral. You know, really crazy concepts. Do we have any Canadians here today? I love Canadians. Hands up. Come on. All right. Hey, what the hell is wrong with you people? Because apparently in 1974, you forgot how to have kids.
I wasn't old enough then.
Uh-huh. Now, what we've got here is an inverted demography. Lots of people in that late 50s, early 60s cohort that are saving for retirement. Canada right now, as a result, is capital rich. This is a population that is saving everything they can. And so the Canadian system has a fairly robust social welfare network because they can afford it. In addition, there's been enough extra capital the last 15 years to fund the development of the Athabasca tar sands area. That couldn't have happened in any other part of the world at any other time in history. Only in Canada, only right now. But in 7 years, when this big bulge moves into mass retirement, that money will stop flowing. In fact, it'll reverse flow, because instead of having all these taxpayers, those former taxpayers will now be drawing pensions and drawing health care benefits. And Canada will go from the most capital rich it's ever been to the most capital poor it's ever been. You'll also notice that there's no replacement generation. There isn't a generation doing the consuming in Canada. We haven't had consumption-led growth in Canada in almost 15 years, and it's not going to come back within the next 40. Here's the United States. Now, where are my baby boomers? People born 1946 to 1965. Come on, hands up, hands up. Oh, wow. The rest of you guys must be sleeping in. Baby boomers are usually the majority of my audience. They're usually like a freaking Roman legion facing me down. The boomers are the largest generation we've ever had as a percentage of the population. And as such, there's certain patterns that have emerged. When they entered the workforce all those years ago, we discovered that one of the problems of the boomer generation was that there's too damn many of them. And so they took all the jobs that were available, and then they took jobs that were below their skill set because there just weren't enough. Now that they're moving towards retirement, exactly the same thing is happening on the investment side. They've swallowed up every investment opportunity that was available in the United States and North America, and now their money is squeezing out, searching for that last little bit of yield before they retire. So there are a lot of decisions in boomer investments that are perhaps not all that wise. So Enron, the boomer's fault. Subprime, the boomer's fault. The brick boom, possible because of the boomers. Where are my Gen Yers? People born 1980 to 1999. You know, it's a little early for you guys, but you know. Oh, hey, thanks for showing. It's hard to get them in the room before 4 o'clock. Now, Gen Y are the second largest demography we've ever had in the United States. They're the boomers' kids. And they face exactly the same wage pressures that the boomers did when they entered the workforce. There's too many of them. They have a couple of advantages that the boomers lacked, though. First of all, they're the most technically savvy and well-educated generation we've ever had. So as we move into this Uber-Lyft economy of part-time work and many career changes, they're actually fairly well prepared for that socially, educationally, technically. Second, 1/3 of them still live at home. And of the remainder, half were only able to move out because their parents are paying for their rent. So we are actually in the midst of the greatest generational wealth transfer in American history right now without anyone having died yet. Which is a disaster for this last group. Where are my Xers? 1966 to 1979. Has anybody seen Marcy? I see everybody but Marcy. We're the smallest group ever. And we're sandwiched in the middle. I mean, when was the last time you picked up a newspaper and actually read about the Xers? It's all the boomers all the time, all the Ys. We entered the workforce to discover there were no jobs because the boomers had taken them all. And so we were the perpetual intern generation, and they wonder why we're always so bitter. And it gets worse. Now that the boomers are nearing mass retirement, the boomers have voted for themselves a quite generous package of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits that will never be undone because Xers will not outnumber the boomers until the Xers are in their 70s. So we're not going to win that fight. And even if it did come up for a vote, you could always count on Gen Y to vote with their parents to prevent reform, because that means that the boomers would have to move in with Gen Y. And from Gen Y's point of view, that's strictly a one-way relationship. So we are looking at a marginal tax increase for the Xers of probably about 50%, just to pay for what the boomers have said that they're going to have. No fun. However, as much as I like to dog on Gen Y, and they do deserve it, thank God they're there for 2 reasons. First of all, you notice that there's kind of a bulge in the bottom there, unlike Canada. The United States currently does have consumption-led growth because of Gen Y's consumption. They're in that magic zone right now. And in 15 years, when Gen Y matures, and I use that word in its loosest possible way, they will fill out the ranks of the tax-paying class in a way that Gen X never could. Right now, we've got a large generation paying for a small generation. Credit costs are low. In a few years, as the boomers retire, that will flip, and we'll have a small generation paying for a large one. It'll suck. But by the time we get to 2030, it flips again. And Gen Y will be our salvation. And what's worse, they're special. Because here's the developed world in 2030 without the United States. Everybody has the Canada disease. And so by the time we get to 2030, we will have segued from a world where the United States is the largest financial power and largest consuming power, and one in which the United States is the only financial power and only consuming power. And it's only 15 years away. So we got 15 years where it's going to kind of suck, particularly for the Xers, and then it'll be okay. Quick around the world, top left, that's South Africa. Walk up that pyramid with me. Primary school, high school, college, 50% chance of catching HIV and dying within 5 years. South Africa as a modern economy is already dead. They can't train up skilled labor faster than it's dying off. Top right, that's the Russian Federation. You had a 60% drop in the Russian birth rate at the end of the Cold War. Little back of envelope math tells us that within the next 5 years, everyone in the Red Army will have been born during the baby bust. which means that the Red Army's in the process of shrinking by half in just the next 5 years. So if the Russians are going to use military tactics to try to change how their world works, they have to do it now. And so they are. Bottom left, People's Republic of China. 25 years after the one-child policy, they are running out of 25-year-olds. They tell me that the Chinese are great at math. I'm not seeing it. It's actually worse than that, because you'll notice there's kind of a blue fringe on the right side of that graphic, right? That's the surplus male population. When you have a patriarchal society, like the Chinese, and you tell people they can only have one child, female infanticide is very common. So there's a 10 to 15% sex imbalance between men and women across most of the provinces of China. That's actually a lot worse than it sounds. Because of the baby bust, the purposeful, engineered baby busts, labor costs in China have expanded by a factor of 9 in the last 15 years. Mexican labor is now half the cost and more highly skilled than Chinese labor. We're seeing the reshoring patterns to support that. And if you were working in a place like Beijing or Hong Kong, and you're a manufacturer, and you've realized that you're running out of labor, literally, you went inland to find new workers to recruit them to come back to the coast with you. But you only brought back the women. Why? You can put 6 chicks in a 300 square foot apartment. You do that with 6 dudes, you will have a severed head in the fridge by the end of the month. Men and women of childbearing age in China are not just separated by socioeconomic status, they are separated by physical province. Now, you may have heard that the Chinese did away with one-child policy last Wednesday. Let's assume for the moment that every Chinese citizen went out and did their patriotic duty that night. Riddle me this. How long does it take to grow a 30-year-old? 30 years and 9 months. So that might improve in a generation, but not before. And then finally, there's New Zealand. That structure look familiar? New Zealand is the only country in the world with a demography similar to the United States. So we've got about a decade to figure out how to fix our healthcare system, because after that, we will be waking up with a hangover every morning, because that's just what it means when you rock it with the Kiwis. So that's 2. Demography here, a little wonky, but actually pretty good. And then finally, we've got shale. This is what I like to call the checkbook map. Every dot is someone with a checkbook, because they can afford to pay the power bill. 3 population centers I want to draw your attention to. Up north, the happening town of Bismarck, North Dakota. In the middle, the rockin' city of Midland, Texas. And down south, this stone-cold, boring corridor of Austin, San Antonio, where I live. People have lights. There they are. What are these? Western North Dakota, please, no one lives there. You've got up north the Bakken Shale Field, in the middle the Permian Basin, and down south the Eagle Ford. Why are they lit up? It's flaring. It's all about transport. When you're dealing with oil and natural gas, as you guys know, oil's easier to move. It's a liquid. It won't go away on you. You can put it in a vat. You can put it into a trunk. You can put it into a rail car. You can gargle with it. Well, don't gargle with it. That's disgusting. You get the point, though. Any series of modes to move or even just store it temporarily, you can't do that with gas. Gas will disperse on you. You have to have a pressurized point of contained production, a pressurized uninterrupted transport system, and a pressurized contained point of consumption. If you don't have that whole chain, you do not have a natural gas industry. Now, here in the United States, we've got the largest and most flexible natural gas transport network in the world, but we can't keep up. Natural gas is coming up, particularly from these 3 fields, not on purpose. It's a waste product, and so it is being flared. And while everybody is building the infrastructure as fast as they can to capture it, the fact remains that natural gas is so cheap that no one's producing it on purpose. Fully half of the natural gas that we used in the United States last year was sold at 0. It's free. The most versatile, flexible industrial commodity on planet Earth in the United States is free. free. Think about what that means. If you're producing it, it's a disaster. If you're consuming it, it's bloody brilliant. There are $900 billion of green and brownfield investment in transport and industrial production across the United States that has already been paid for, that will all be operational by 2020 to make use of the free natural gas. It is the biggest industrial build-out that we have seen in this country since 1943. And we were a little busy in 1943. The industry that's by far benefiting the most is electricity. The blue line shows you where electricity prices flatlined 7 years ago when the shale revolution started. Even in New York, the national average is blue, New York is in red. Even in New York, where there's a few wibbles along the way, it's pretty much stopped the upward march. The green line, that's Texas, where power prices have dropped by 1/4 in the last 5 years. And that just leaves California, where, as you guys know, energy consumption is thoroughly encouraged, but energy production sometimes is flat out illegal. Say that joke in San Francisco and the room's quiet, so thank you. And this is the new norm. California is not the holdout, that's not fair. But California is the aberration, it's the anomaly in the American system. We'll talk about that more and more and more here in future slides, because the split is getting bigger. Shale's becoming more. With the price drop of the last year, instead of driving shale out of business, all the companies have been forced into tighter confines and been forced to look at each other's notes, sometimes illegally, consolidate, and take the best practices and push down the price points across the board. There are about 10 major technologies that are core to this. 2 of them I want to talk about real quickly because they're very applicable to your situation. The first one is seismic. Now, we've all know what seismic is in the oil industry. You have a sound truck, sends down sonar, the sound waves bounce back up, you get a little grainy image like this that helps you decide kind of where to put your stick in the ground. Well, in the last year, shale has taken 2D seismic and made it 3D and 4D, so you can get a full picture of the entire reservoir in real time while you're drilling. And so you can drill down into my heel and down my body, down my arm, and this is the leg I broke, so I can't bounce. Anyway, and into a curved finger without missing anything. You know exactly where the petroleum is. The results of this are just absolutely gorgeous. We haven't drilled a dry shale well in the United States in 1.5 years. We haven't drilled a low productivity well in 10 months. You guys have heard of the 20-80 rule that the shale guys use? 20% of the frac stages have 80% of the petroleum. Well, now we know which 20%. So you don't frack the stuff you don't need to. The cost of water, of proppant, of chemicals, of labor, they've all dropped by 2/3 just because of this one tech. And now we're splicing that with new drilling technology. 5 years ago, you'd go down a mile into the shale fields, then you'd go horizontally 600 feet. 2 years later, you could go horizontally a full mile, increase of a reach of 9 to 10. 2 years after that, you'd combine all that surface infrastructure into a single pad, and you could send up to 20 vertical shafts down from exactly the same place. So your surface infrastructure costs collapsed. And in the last year, we've figured out how to turn corners within the well shaft. Instead of 20 vertical spears going down, you just have one, but you still have 20 to 30 horizontal miles of shaft to collect petroleum. Input costs have collapsed. We're not in an energy production recession in Texas or Oklahoma or North Dakota or Pennsylvania. We're in an energy production input recession. So if you're producing steel or sand or anything else, it's a mess. But if you're just producing the energy, it's actually not so bad. Which leads us to this. The horizontal axis, that's the volume of oil produced. The vertical axis, that's the cost per barrel. The light blue, that's US shale as of 2012. As you can see, it was very expensive, not a lot came out of it. Here's where we are today. In the big 4 shale fields, the break-even price is now under $45 a barrel, pushing towards 40 by the end of the year. by the end of next year, when these technologies and several others like refracking become industry norm in the shale fields, you're looking at a break-even price below 35. And it's just getting moving. Remember, the price point that we are at today is with less than half of the shale providers being masters of all these new technologies. They will all have them all mastered within a year. So you are looking at a fundamental break in how the national petroleum complex works. And I realize that it got really quiet in this room because you're all very sad about that. I do have some good news, but not for a few more slides. Because let's talk absolute numbers now. The blue, that is American oil production. The red and the green are imports from Canada and Mexico. The double hash is 2007. That's when shale became commercially viable. Here's consumption. It's dropping. 3 reasons. 1, we had a recession. Industrial output dropped. Consumption dropped with it. But that ended 6.5 years ago. Demand has yet to recover. Second, what was second? Tech. Demand destruction. When oil prices are over about 80 bucks a barrel, you start changing the way you operate. You put up solar panels. You buy a Prius. I did both. These don't just destroy demand when you have them. They stay part of the housing stock or part of the car fleet for 20 to 30 years. It's freaking Toyota. Each Prius on the road, over the lifespan of the car, destroys 150 barrels of crude demand. That doesn't sound like much. 150 for 20 years? Until you realize there's 4 million of those suckers on the road, and that one technology has reduced gross American demand by 1%. That one technology. I bought a 60-inch TV screen for myself for Christmas last year because I was a very good boy in 2014. It cost $12 a year to run. We now have 15 years of infrastructure and tech baked in that we've already paid for and implemented that will destroy demand for 15 years to come. And then finally, there's demography. When you're 30, you drive to work, you take your kids to soccer practice. When you're 55, you just drive to work. And when you're 70, you don't drive much at all because your kids are trying to take away your car. Per capita oil demand declines with age. And in 2007, the oldest of the baby boomers retired. So we're looking at that black line being steady to negative for 15 years, while that blue line is steady to positive for at least as long. That means that North America, writ large, will be net zero oil importer sometime in 2017. But not here. You are on the wrong side of the Rockies. You don't play in the shale revolution. The rest of the country cannot get you the oil and natural gas in sufficient volumes to change the math on the West Coast. Actually, specifically in California. Oregon is broadly self-sufficient. Washington has access to Canadian crude. In fact, Alaska is the one state in the country that can actually export crude legally, and they don't like sending it to you anymore. Let me show you why. Because we're seeing a change in the global price structure that is hugely to California's detriment. Here's where we were in 2007. You had 2 major markets, the United States and Western Europe, that were large consumers, dynamic consumers, and they took crude from 30 different sources. Ecuadorian crude to Florida, Angolan crude to Spain, you name it. Many, many, many different kinds of contracts you could play. And then the Asians, the dear sweet Asians, they would take any barrel that anyone could get to them and they would pay a premium for it. This is the world that the super majors loved because they could play arbitrage on this. So for a vertically integrated, horizontally diversified company, they had thousands of contracts a day that they could trade against one another. This was perfect for them. Then it all went to hell. 2 things changed. First of all, in the European Union, you had the financial crisis, which relegated economic growth forever to history. And the number of players in the European market collapsed. You had a surge of output out of the Russians, and all of a sudden, instead of 30 suppliers, they dropped really down to 4. Not as much arbitrage. In the United States, the shale revolution reduced American net oil imports by 9 million barrels a day in 6 years. And so now we're down to basically 4 suppliers as well. If you want to sell your crude, you pretty much have to find a way to get it to Asia. So the Asian premium still exists, but instead of being the $3 to $7 a barrel that it was 10 years ago, it's really only now about $1, $1.50. A lot of the joy has left the energy sector, but not as much as it has for the super majors. Here's where we were in terms of their total share of oil, gas, and refining capacity in the United States in 2003, and here's where they were 10 years later. Shale oil is different from what you guys produce. We all know that the global crude stream is getting heavier and more sour, right? 2/3 of the total that is produced right now is that crappy crap. Crappy crap? Yeah, that's really sophisticated, Peter. It's low grade. It requires fantastic refineries. It's thick. It's like toothpaste. Not shale. Shale crude is trapped at the moment of formation within the rock strata. It doesn't percolate through like conventional crude. And since it doesn't move, it can't pick up contaminants like sulfur or mercury. Which means that when you frack it and get it out of the ground, it's like 60 degrees API with 0.01% sulfur. I call it white chicken oil because you can wave a white chicken in front of it and get gasoline. Well, for the super majors who like to spend $10 billion on a project that doesn't produce its first barrel of crude for a decade, this is a disaster. Because their refineries, their state-of-the-art industrial base, suddenly is losing out to somebody with a tea kettle. And in terms of production, it doesn't fit their math either. A really complicated shale well in 2014 cost $26 million and started producing within 6 weeks. And so the super majors are finding them forced out of the entire shale industry, and shale is now responsible for roughly 3/4 of American energy production. Natural gas production in the Gulf of Mexico is already shut down. Can't compete. And the next stage is getting really disastrous for the majors, because North America is very, very nearly at energy independence, and the European recession is getting deeper and deeper. And so we're seeing that if you want to sell crude really anywhere, you have to get it to Asia. And so the Asian premium has now turned into a discount. Where's California in that? Well, it's a 7,000-mile sail from the Persian Gulf to Japan. It's a 10,000-mile to get to you. You're still paying a premium. Now, with oil at 45 to 50, you're not feeling it unless you're in production. But there's hope. In less than 5 years, probably something closer to 2, you're going to be seeing a breakdown in major production zones in at least 2 parts of the world. And they're the 2 parts that produce the most for export, the former Soviet Union and the Middle East. And when that happens, at the same time that the United States basically backs away from the trade order, at the same time the United States becomes the only consuming power, and at the same time that the United States becomes formally and technically energy independent, well, let's just say that the math of transport changes considerably. And instead of having 14 million barrels of surplus crude that is sailing around Malacca and going up to Northeast Asia, there might be 5. You have to take your share out of that 5. And so the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, all of a sudden, you're not competing in this big bowl of crude, you're competing for a small little cup of it. Let me show you how that price is going to split. Well, actually, I've got one more thing to say on that slide. We're looking at a price split just around the corner between a North American system where prices are set by private companies that produce in small amounts over short-haul transport in a rule of law-based system, where prices will probably never breach 50. And then a global system where supply is disrupted, where the big state players are in play, and where the transport routes are measured in thousands of miles, where prices will probably never drop below 150 for the next 20 years. We haven't had this sort of split since World War II. Now let me show you how that's breaking down. First of all, Canada. I mentioned that you guys are on the wrong side of the Rockies, right? Well, all the shale in the United States that's in production is between the Rockies and the Appalachians, which is exactly where the Albertans have to send all of their oil and natural gas. So it's the most super saturated part of the market. Canadian crude typically sells at a $5 to $10 discount to American crude. American crude sells at a $5 to $10 discount to global crude. This really sucks if you're from Alberta, because without the appropriate infrastructure, you have to rail it everywhere, and that costs 10 bucks a barrel. The Canadians were hoping, well, the Albertans were hoping, that they could build Keystone and several pipelines like it and hardwire Canadian crude supplies into the American refining network. They're not looking to re-export. Nobody can take this stuff. No one could deal with it. But if you mix Canadian super heavy with shale super light, you get a medium blend that the American refining network can handle. And the Canadians would have hardwired themselves into the American petroleum network for the next 30 years. Without Keystone, there is not an Albertan oil production zone that is cost-effective at current pricing. And because the Albertans simply can't get their crude out to the wider world, we are looking at the complete shutdown of the tar sands over the next 15 years. If there is a future in Albertan energy, one of two things will have to happen. One, they'll have to make the switch entirely to shale. They're working on that where they can. Or two, Alberta will have to secede from the Canadian Federation. That's a whole different presentation. Next, former Soviet Union. The red on this map are Russian majority populations. The orange are Russophilic populations. They like Russian culture, they speak the Russian language, they're just not actually Russian citizens or Russian ethnics. And then the green, those are what I like to call the Stockholm Syndrome states. They really, really miss the Soviet period. Now, the entire western periphery of the Russian system, all 2,500 miles of it, the highest physical barrier between the Russian populated zones and everybody else is about the size of a Kansas interstate on-ramp. Wide open territories that everybody has loved to march across throughout history. And so the Russians think of themselves as incredibly insecure. Now, in the Russian ideal, the Russian army would be able to sweep forth and plug these 5 geographic gaps, from the Baltic to the Carpathians to the Caucasus. And the Russians feel that if they could pull that off, the territory that they have to defend shrinks from 2,500 miles to 600 miles. And that is something that they could do with an army that's half the size that it is today. So that's their goal. When you look at things like Ukraine, you're really just seeing the first step. There are 9 other countries that have to fall. Someone, somewhere, will think that targeting or manipulating energy infrastructure is a particularly good idea when a war starts to rage, whether it's the Russians looking to cut things off to a rival, or a target looking to deny the Russians leverage. And here is the Russian oil and natural gas export network. 6 million barrels per day and 15 BCF a day of natural gas facing some degree of supply risk simply from military activity. That alone, half of that alone, would be enough to add $100 to your average barrel of crude. Not to be outdone, there's the Middle East. The United States has kept the Middle East open, has always had a carrier battle group in the region specifically to keep the Saudis and the Iranians apart. The idea being that in any sort of free trade environment, which was core to our security throughout the Cold War, is you have to keep the energy flowing, otherwise there is no trade order. You'd have a global recession in a matter of days. Well, we don't care anymore. You may have noticed the aircraft carriers haven't been on station for half of this year. That's not the new normal. That's a transition to the new normal where they're not there at all. Now, the Iranians and the Saudis are starting to eye each other warily. The Saudis have been more aggressive in this. They're actually pushing against the Iranians in 8 major military conflicts throughout the region. Syria, by the way, is what it looks like when the Saudis are winning. Ugly, but that's the Middle East. These two are opposed politically, economically, militarily, strategically, you name it. And because of the shale revolution, they are now transporting exactly the same product along exactly the same routes to exactly the same customers. This is going to break soon. And in particular, I want to point out a couple of areas. That's a really long-winded way of saying that this is basically just another great rivalry. So think of it as kind of like the Texas A&M UT rivalry, just with more guns. And like all great rivalries, eventually some fans end up at the wrong bar. And that's what these are. Up here in Iran at the UT Tower, they call it Khuzestan. You've got 3 million ethnic Arabs in a Persian state. The Arabs are seen as a dispossessed, troublemaking minority, and curfews are pretty normal. Khuzestan happens to be sitting atop 80% of Iran's oil production, and the Saudis have already targeted the Arabs of Khuzestan as a potential fifth column. Not to be outdone, down here in Kyle Field, the Saudis call it Gwar, also home to the Abqaiq oil processing facility, in Ras Tanura, the world's largest offloading facility. You've got 3 million Saudi Shias in a Sunni country. The Iranians are already very active trying to penetrate that population. Just these 2 red arrows point directly at 11 million barrels per day of production and export infrastructure. That assumes that nobody else gets caught in the crosshairs. That assumes that the Kuwaitis or the Emiratis or the Qataris don't get involved at all. If a quarter of that comes offline, you have another $100 per barrel. Not to be outdone, you have East Asia. Now you'll notice on the left all those green bars and on the right all the red bars. The green bars are net oil exports. The red bars are net oil imports. They're a convenient 7,000 miles apart. And if we enter into a world where either Russian supplies or Middle Eastern supplies are compromised at all, there is not enough physical crude to supply everybody. So if you are in Korea or Japan or China or Taiwan, the only way that you can make sure that your needs are filled are to actually go to the Persian Gulf and get it. So we're going to have convoy systems again. It's been a long time since that, huh? And as we all know, the Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and Taiwanese have a centuries-long history of brotherly cooperation and love. There's no chance that anything will go wrong in that. Not only are those 4 countries going to have to pick sides in a Middle Eastern knife fight, should we have one tanker, just one, come under attack or confiscation by one of those 4 navies, that is the end of the global supply chain system. The supply chain system of the last 70 years has been built on the concept of cheap and safe maritime transport. So you take a supply chain and you break it up into pieces. You get the chairs from Malaysia, you get the engine block from China, you assemble it all in Mexico. You know, you break it up to whoever can do that step of the chain cheapest. You raise the marginal cost of transport by 1%, half of the world's supply chains are no longer viable. That alone is enough to shatter the Chinese system. There's another dozen reasons, but this isn't a China presentation. Which brings us back to you guys. Let me go back to this. Oh no, never mind. This is where I went. So, we're going to be in a world where if you take California plus the Northeast Asians, there's about 1/3 of the amount of crude that is actually necessary to keep everybody online. And you are at the very end of the world's largest supply run. 800,000 barrels per day is imported right now. By the end of next year, you will be the #1 oil importing state. By the end of 2017, you will import more crude than the rest of the 50 states put together. And you're at the end of the global supply chain. So if anything goes wrong anywhere, you're the first one to lose access. So we will have $50 crude in Texas. And they will have $200 crude in Japan. And here, if it's under $250, I would be shocked. So, if you're a consumer, this is where you cry. If you're a producer, I believe it was Lorelei who said that Sacramento keeps coming up with crises and Kern County has to keep coming up with solutions. You will be called upon to triple oil production in less than 5 years. I really wasn't expecting applause for that one. Because until you do, California faces an energy-induced depression that it will not recover from, while the rest of the world or the rest of the country is growing at 2, 3, 4%, and actually having its greatest industrial renaissance ever. I want to look at 2 more things, then we'll open to questions. First of all, these are the energy plays of the future, so you know who your competition is. Anyone who is blue, you can't mess this up from an energy production point of view. Anyone who's green, you could mess it up, but it really takes some forward thinking. A couple things I want to point out, like for example, Saudi Arabia. They have to not fall in a war with Iran. That would really crimp their energy output. Or Brazil, really you just need to shoot everybody in Congress. I mean, you guys think Sacramento or Washington are bad. Wow, go to Brasilia, it's a nightmare. Countries in yellow. These countries could make it, but it's going to require a very steady hand and a lot of very forward-looking policies for them to kind of pull themselves out of the fire. And for countries in red, you are looking at a quintessential breakdown in the capacity of the countries to produce crude. So you're looking overall at probably a 30 to 40% reduction in what is freely available in global crude markets. The price increases from that are actually very good for you, but it's going to make for a very complicated supply picture for California writ large in the years in between. And then here we've got tight oil production from the major plays. The green and the dark blue shades are the big three plays of the Permian, the Bakken, and the Eagle Ford. Here is the Monterey. I don't see this as a negative. It's that little red sliver on top. That's all it is. I don't see this as a negative. The shale sector has spent the last 10 years building up a set of best practices that are now in the process of percolating across the industry and will be the norm by the end of next year. To give you an idea of where you can fit into this, because of 4D seismic, you can be more productive in your first day than the Texans were in year 7. Think of water. What were the numbers that Oliver gave us? 14,000 gallons per well? 20. Okay, that comes down to about 400 gallons per barrel. Now, a shale well, when it's being instituted, uses about 10 million, but you only have to do that once. So it uses, over the life of the well, 1% of the water. You can ride, you're the second, you've got the second mover advantage here. You already have the legal infrastructure, you already have the financial infrastructure, you already have half of the physical infrastructure. You can have a boom that is much faster than anything that happened in Pennsylvania, North Dakota, or Texas. So a tripling in 5 years, it's theoretically possible. You just have to survive until the world goes to hell. With that, let me leave this up. This is what I call the global stability map. Countries in blue are the ones that will rule the chaos to come. Countries in green, more or less the same situation they're in today. Yellow and brown are where things start to fall apart. If you are in yellow, you have something going for you. A unified population, self-sufficient in food, a strong ally, something that will let you meet the challenges of the new era head on. You won't always win, but you'll still be there. If you're in brown, you won't. And you're looking at state breakdown, particularly along the edges. If you're in red, if you don't know a country that's in red, don't bother learning their names now because they won't be there in 5 years. All right, you guys have been great. I think you are the first audience I've had in 3 weeks that actually laughed at every single joke. And that means a lot to me, so thank you. And I got like 11 minutes for question, which is unheard of. So please, have at it. Not all at once. There we go.
Peter, with your thesis that there's going to be a California premium in this high cost of energy produced, what do you say in terms of the potential for disruptive technology to sweep in here, especially with such political support in Sacramento?
Is there any particular disruptive technology you have your eye on?
There's a host of them. Of
For
course,
example,
solar is one.
Solar, sure.
There could be others as well.
As a rule, solar and oil don't compete.
Correct.
The only way that solar could compete is if suddenly we can find our way around the storage issue. And I hate to split hairs with PG&E, but that's just not going to happen anytime soon. The lithium, there's not enough lithium in the world to do city-level storage. And if we were to do that in a meaningful way, even if the technology worked, you're talking about dealing with Bolivia. And if you think OPEC was bad, holy crap. The big problem is it's just the physics of lithium cannot do it. 2,000 recharge cycles. And the battery's pretty much fried. And on a normal day, simply because of cloud cover, you're looking at 5 or 6 recharge cycles a day. So you're talking about a complete replacement of the battery infrastructure every 2 years at most. And the production of lithium is actually more carbon intensive than a natural gas burning power plant. So from a carbon point of view, it's actually a loss. Doesn't mean that solar is not part of the solution. It's a huge part of the solution in the right place. And so from you folks south and stretching east to the Texas-Louisiana border, the Sun Belt, it's called that for a reason. Solar is obviously part of the solution there. But this 50% of total goal that you guys have, you're going to burn a lot of money going and nowhere near that. I think it would be very wise for the folks in Sacramento to perhaps look at the energy event in Germany, where they've spent €1 trillion installing photovoltaic as well as improving their grid in order to handle the surge and move towards a carbon-free system. Noble goal. However, the sun doesn't shine in Germany. So, nameplate capacity of their solar facilities are 70% of total. In practicality, it only generates 5% of their electricity. Obviously, California is not in that bad of a situation, but you got to match the technology to your situation. Wow, this is a shy group. Got one over here.
Jack, I'm coming.
So we currently import natural gas from the San Juan Basin and other states. So why not just solve the problem that way?
I have no doubt that more infrastructure is going to go out to try to tap the area, particularly Texas, West Texas. A couple things are problematic. One, building a trunk line of meaningful size from the Permian Basin out to California, assuming that the Californians were proactive in paying for it and permitting it, will take 7 years. It's too late. Second, that pipeline has already been built the other way to basically pump the free natural gas into the Houston core and make a second energy hub that is chemical-based. And so the United States is already in the process of driving natural gas-fueled facilities, especially in industry and chemicals and refining, out of business in the Persian Gulf and the East Asian Rim because they can now outcompete in Houston. So if you do want that, I think it's a good idea. The money has to come first, the permitting has to come first, and then there's a conversation. Because when it comes to the Texas oil man, they're all about saving money, and that means waste gas has to no longer be wasted. And they're way ahead of you on that. Wow, pin drop. Okay, well, I'm going to be sticking around for a bit, so if you guys have a private question that you want to ask me in the corner where no one can hear, or you just want to beat me up in general, you are welcome to it. Thank you all very much.